Okay, good morning, everyone. My name is Dave Holder. I'm one of the West Hampton Township Historical Commissioners. Welcome to the second in our continuing series of historical lectures. Today we're going to hear about Abraham Lincoln and his historical and surprising connections to Chester County. Our speaker today is Malcolm Johnstone. He's a local historian and was executive director of the Westchester Business Improvement District until 2020. He's currently the community engagement officer for arts, culture, and historic preservation at the Cultural Alliance of Chester County, an initiative of the Chester County Community Foundation, which is located in the historic Lincoln Building at 28 West Market Street in downtown Westchester. Malcolm is the author of the book For the Union that discusses how the first biography of Lincoln came about and its influence on Lincoln's election. So please welcome Malcolm Johnstone here to Westtown Township.
Thank you very much. I'm very pleased to be here and to share this information with you. And I'm going to start with a quote. Quote is this: among the distinguished men who, by their patriotism and eloquence, have assisted to create and sustain the party of constitutional freedom, which now predominates in most of the free states, there is no one who has a firmer hold on the confidence and affections of the people of the Great West, or is more an object of their enthusiastic admiration than Abraham Lincoln of Springfield, Illinois. That is the opening sentence of an article that we refer to as the first biography of Abraham Lincoln that was published by Joseph J. Lewis in the Chester County Times on February 11, 1860. And indeed, that biography launched the presidential campaign for Abraham Lincoln, and nobody went more kicking around about not doing this than Abraham Lincoln himself. He was not convinced that he could ever be elected president, and it took some strong wills from Pennsylvania and some friends from Illinois to talk him into it, and a very surprising event that occurred in 1861, which of course we will be covering. So let's move to this handsome young fellow, Abraham Lincoln. This is before he was crushed by the presidency. You can see simply by looking at him that he appears to be inquisitive and also a little bit shy. Though not too shy to have photographs taken. He must have had 50 or 60 taken. And he wanted people to know about him. He did indeed want to be the president of the United States. He simply didn't think that he could be the president. And in order to give you a background of why he became a successful candidate, we're going to have to go back in time. And we'll go back to William Penn. And there's a nice young William Penn, age 22. That is him. He's looking all royal because he's trying to impress the royalty that actually were not impressed with him at all, because he became a Quaker. And he thought of everyone as being equal. The King of England knew otherwise. There are the citizens of England and there are the royalty. There's a big difference. And William Penn actually had spent time in jail because of his thoughts of equality. But he never really got on the bad side of the king. And he had an opportunity to meet with the king and actually come up with a bit of a win-win strategy that you might recall. The win-win strategy was that he went to King Charles II. He's the one who's being seated there. And he brought with him a document indicating that he would make a promise. He's standing there with his document and his sword. I find it difficult to believe he actually had a sword in the presence of the king. They didn't usually do that. But nevertheless, he had a compromise to work out that he and his Quaker friends would all leave England and go to the New World in exchange for having property, which was dedicated to the royalty. It was what we would now call Pennsylvania, but back in those days, they really didn't know what to call it. It was part of the New World only. And it would all be dedicated to William Penn and his followers, and they could do whatever they wanted because they were, after all, thousands of miles from the king, and that worked for him. Actually, was a better situation for King too, because the king owed the family of William Penn quite a bit of money. His father, Admiral Sir William Penn, contributed a great deal of funds in fighting the wars, and he wanted to get paid back, but it wasn't enough gold in the royal treasury to actually pay back the family. So it was an exchange of property for the cash that was owed to the family. And so when they get to what is now Pennsylvania, it's more or less what it looked like. Believe it or not, you won't find any of the towns on that because they haven't been created yet. This was simply a place where, and if you look towards the top and in the middle, you'll see something that says the Welch Tract. That is where most of the Quakers would end up. And William Penn himself, right, that little square that says Free Society of Trade, that was his entrepreneurial move. William Penn would use that property, develop it. He wasn't quite sure what it would look like, but he thought that if he kept the property and did it correctly in development, it could make him a very wealthy man. Instead, it almost made him bankrupt. But that's the way things go when you're trying to develop a new country. So what happened several decades after this was something that changed everything for the population. And it was this in 1688, a slave ship, the first slave ship to actually arrive in Philadelphia. Most slave ships were coming to the Americas long before this, but they're all going south. But this one arrived in Philadelphia. And the slaves were treated in an inhumane fashion. They were treated worse than even livestock on a farm, and this was noted. But what horrified the Quakers in Philadelphia was that they were each put up for auction and were sold to the highest bidder. Some went to the farms, some went to houses, some would become servants, but all would become slaves. And the Quakers, who thought of everyone as being equal, were outraged that we had a segment of our world population that was far from being equal. And as a matter of fact, there was a fellow by the name of Toons Koenders, and he, in 1688, he was actually living in Germantown. In 1688, he decided to get together with as many Quakers who were willing to voice dissension on this particular part of society. He managed to find only 3, but nevertheless, they put together the very first formal protest against human slavery here in the New World. It did not happen in New York or New England. It did not happen certainly down south in Virginia. It happened first in Pennsylvania. And this was the beginning of abolition as history has come to know it. And there was a very interesting young man, he's not looking too young right there. At the time, this fellow by the name of Benjamin Lay, he stood about 4 feet tall on a good day. And as you can see, he has a very large head and tiny little legs, and that is actually what he looked like. I don't know why he looked like that, but that was him. And in his hand is a treatise that he composed against slavery. And he wanted that treatise to be given throughout the free world to convince the populations of the evils of slavery. So he went to Ben Franklin, who published the treatise. Unfortunately, it's somewhat unreadable. It got very thick in its language, but nevertheless, it was a document that clearly stated why slavery was evil in our country. And sure enough, his action began to see formal action taken with the colonial governments that they would not allow slavery at the extent that we were seeing it down south. And in many cases, opportunities for slaves to become free. And that was supported by an association called the Abolitionist Society of 1775. They finally all organized there. And that's their logo, whatever that means. It's one of the more interesting words I've come across. At the top, it says, work and be happy. And you see 2 individuals, presumably men. One is white, and he's holding the hand of a black man who is also in shackles. And the idea is that white people would lead black people into freedom, perhaps after their stint of being slaves. One way or the other, they would all gain their freedom. And that would take many dozens of years to do that. But then something happened that began to solidify the community of Westchester. And that one thing was a horrible thing for its day and would be even more horrible today. And that was that this woman by the name of Hannah Miller, in 1805, she was hanged. The reason that she was hanged is that she was accused of murdering her child, infanticide, as a matter of fact. Her child, a newborn baby, a boy, was found beneath floorboards of the home that she was a servant in, and the baby was dead. It may have actually been born dead, we don't know. But there was what you might call an investigation by the authorities that determined that she had indeed murdered her child, and she was put on trial. And at the trial, she was convicted and sentenced to die by hanging. Not an unusual thing. In fact, that was very, very common. Very few got off on that. But there was a difference. And when I say that there were more than one, it probably happened once or twice a year that a woman would be taken into court for the death of her own child. But what would happen to Hannah Miller was different than what would happen if she had been white. Had she been white, yes, she would have been convicted and sentenced to be hanged. But the governor, after hearing that justice had been told, the governor would step in and show mercy and would give a reprieve to the woman. And perhaps the woman would have to serve a few months in jail. But by and large, justice and mercy would both be shown, but not in the case of Hannah Miller. She was, after all, a black woman. And the governor, for whatever reason, thought that a reprieve was not deserved by Hannah Miller. As a result, she became the first person, much less the first woman, to be hanged in Westchester. And the hanging place was just east of town, you know, where the roads kind of connect on Market Street and Gay Street. And right across the street is a cemetery, a black cemetery. And that's where gallows were set up. And even to this day, there are people in Westchester that call it Gallows Hill. And sure enough, the gallows were set up and she would be hanged there. There was a very unexpected event along with that. And that was that the population, particularly around Philadelphia, down in Delaware, they thought of this as a circus. A woman was going to be hanged. Better yet, a black woman was going to be hanged. And they began to treat it as if it were a carnival event. And while Westchester only had 800-900 people in 1805, there were people pouring into the community, estimated about 5,000. And they began drinking, it became a giant party, and the star of the show would be a woman being hanged. So Quakers within the community were horrified at this action. As a result of that, it took them a few decades, but as a result, they forbid any public hangings. There were henceforth 8 or 9 hangings that took place after this were always in prison. But this left a scar upon the community of Westchester. And particularly of a gentleman by the name of William Everhart. Now, William Everhart, not only in Westchester, but he knew the entire county of Chester, and he was quite the entrepreneurial person. He opened several stores in and around Westchester. Well, Westchester was the last of the stores that he opened. And he did that. When he came to Westchester, he noticed that there had to be a farm for sale, a farm called the Woolerton Farm. It's that area just south of Market Street, and it's 102 acres. Mr. Woolerton family had been wanting to sell the farm for quite a long time, and they made a deal with Mr. Everhart, who bought the property and then developed it. He literally doubled the size of Westchester with this development. And indeed, that was 1833 that he did that. And indeed, Westchester sees that as the second development of Westchester. William Everhart not only developed that land, but he developed the first office building in Westchester that we now call the Lincoln Building, but in its day it was called the Everhart Building. And it was the largest of the commercial buildings in Westchester, 1833 when it opened. It was a structure that had no facilities for residential. It was only for business. That was the first of its type for commercial buildings. And it became, well, the center of town, much like its neighbor right next door, which was built by this fellow and designed by this fellow named William Strickland, who gave us the mansion house that appears right next to what we call the Lincoln Building. It's on the corner of Market and Church Street. And that became the center of town. It's the center of town because it was considered the finest hotel outside of Philadelphia, and it had a restaurant. Believe it or not, it was the very first built structure to get flush toilets. And if that doesn't bring the ladies, I don't know. That was the center of town, the anchor for the center of town. And the restaurant had a reputation It was, of course, a very fine restaurant, and people would go there. But they had inside the restaurant a little cage, and the cage had these little baby monkeys. And the monkeys, I don't know if they're really baby monkeys or not, but they all wore diapers. And periodically, the monkeys would reach into the diapers. If they found anything of interest, they would then fling it at the guests. This was to the endless delight of the residents of Westchester and to the annoyance of all of the guests. But you do what you can to attract the crowd, right? So again, this was the center of town. Across the street, actually, Cape Corner from this was a shop owned by William Everhart. And it was another shop, grocery store across the street from that. Right down the street was the post office on Tripp Street, and there was a telegraph office, which became very important. Nothing connects a community like having a telegraph office. That is indeed the internet of the day, and we'll be getting to that in just a moment. So we go on to look at a couple of other notable people. This person is Thomas U. Walter. He became the leading architect in Westchester. He designed, among other things, the courthouse right there. But he was such a great designer and architect. In 1848, he was asked to relocate to Washington, D.C., where he became the so-called architect of the Capitol. And he was the one who designed the dome on the Capitol building, the iconic dome of the Capitol building. So we have a nice connection right there with Thomas U. Walter. And we go on to see by the 1850s, 40s, and 50s, because of the investment that was being made by the entrepreneurs, we have a nice little town. This is High Street, looking up from Market Street. You see the courthouse tower, and that clock tower, which dates all the way back to the 1820s. It was removed from that particular courthouse and put onto the current sort of courthouse. So that was into the 1840s. You see some office buildings. There's a hotel on the right-hand side. That's Turk's Head Hotel. Turk's Head is what was Westchester used to be called Turk's Head, because that was the name of the bar. Why not name the town after the favorite bar? Right? And there are a number of banks and very historic buildings. And this was the earliest creation picture that we had of Westchester. And then something very not very good happened with this gentleman, James Buchanan, 1856, and an election is coming up for who should be president. There are lots of folks who want to vie for it. James Buchanan was from Lancaster. He was the only person to be elected president that lived in Pennsylvania until we get to Joe Biden, who of course from Scranton. But he became a favorite son, and it's a good thing for him in his quest for the presidency because he needed Pennsylvania. And Pennsylvania needed a president, or so they thought, that understood the rights of all people, that understood what freedom was really about. So there were a number of Quakers who gathered in Westchester, and they made an appointment to go up to see Mr. Buchanan. They went up to Mr. Buchanan and they sat down and asked him point blank how he felt about freedom, about slavery, about what might be an impending civil war. And believe it or not, he told them exactly what they wanted to hear. Though exactly what they wanted to hear was nothing he ever delivered. In fact, the ink had barely dried on his inaugural speech before one of the very first actions that came out of his administration, though it was for the Supreme Court, he fully supported it, was that through the Dred Scott case, anyone of color was no longer had any rights delivered to them whatsoever, whether they were former slaves or born in Massachusetts or whatever. No, if you were a person of color, you had no impending rights. The Quakers within Westchester were horrified by this. They felt like they had taken 43 steps back from where they fell. So now we get to the little cluster of folks that would get another president. Every 4 years, we all know, there will be a new president, even though they served 2 terms, there were very few in the 1800s that were able to do that. But this fellow is Abraham Lincoln. He's giving this speech in Illinois. Seated beside him is Stephen Douglas. And of course, this is part of the Douglas-Lincoln or Lincoln-Douglas debates. They gave their debates in their quest for becoming a senator from Illinois. And it was a remarkable political event. Everything that they had to say was written down. And so where they stood became not only useful for the voters of Illinois, but also became useful for anyone outside of Illinois to learn about Mr. Lincoln. This was arranged by a fellow named Jesse Fell. He was born in Chester County, South Henneman to be exact, and Jesse Fell followed the tracks of his brother who had moved from Pennsylvania to Illinois. And Jesse Fell decided he was going to walk to Illinois. Only took him 2 years to get there, but he managed to do that. And while he was on his way, by the way, he planted trees. So he was one of those early horticulturalists who believed more trees are better than none. He made it to Illinois, actually got to Springfield, and he was staying at a house, a boarding house. The same one Abraham Lincoln stayed at when he would be there to do business in the capital. And so Jesse Fell, being close to the age of Abraham Lincoln, and Abraham Lincoln became pretty good friends. And Jesse Fell had a talent for organizing things like political debates. And Lincoln was. Lincoln didn't really like organizing things. He definitely liked getting in front of people and running the politics. They became a team. And there was another fellow, and this is Joseph Jackson Lewis. He lived in downtown Westchester, and he had an office at the Everhart Building, now the Lincoln Building. He was a lawyer and a firm abolitionist, one of the great abolitionists. He believed that Black people would be better if they were educated, and he supported college education in Chester County. And as you know, we have 2 colleges that are considered to be Black universities. He was among the first to establish these things. He actually took on interns and those who wanted to, quote unquote, read the law as they get out of college and transition and become a professional lawyer. And he would bring in Black students to do that. And the community would be up in arms that we're teaching a Black man to be an attorney. And they had harsh words to share with Joseph J. Lewis. And it fell on deaf ears. He had nothing to do with that. And indeed had to have been 50 years ahead of its time. But one of the things that he had going for himself was a connection to a local newspaper called the Chester County Times. And if we move ahead to this woman who will play a major role, the Chester County Times was published and written, of course, right there at the Lincoln Building, then called the Everhart Building. And he could actually get an article into that. And what he needed to know was more about Mr. Lincoln. So he contacted this friend of his, Jesse Fell. He contacted him and said, can you send me some information about Lincoln so that I might be able to do an article about Lincoln, and maybe we could get the electorate into who knows, making him president. And sure enough, it was mailed to him in early 1860. And our good friend, Jesse Bell, had asked Lincoln to come up with these notes. And Joseph Lewis reviewed the notes, and he was totally underwhelmed. And he telegraphed Mr. Bell and said, I need more information, a lot more information. And this is where we get into the internet. I'm so impressed that this young woman, her name is Emma Hunter. She was among the first, if not the first, of the telegraph operators in the world. She would certainly rank no higher than third. And at the age of 19, 1851, she became a telegraph operator and had that position her entire life. And she was able to transmit information at the speed of light almost anywhere in the country back in those days. Without her and her telegraph office, there simply would not have been enough time for the communication between Illinois and Pennsylvania. And so what happened was then the Chester County Times published what they referred to as the first biography of Abraham Lincoln. Joseph Lewis had taken the information they had, and I read earlier, start out this presentation, the very first sentence that he wrote into that, and of course, it read like a political tract. Something that was beyond whatever Abraham Lincoln or Jesse Bell could have done. But the reason that was important was because Abraham Lincoln got an opportunity. The opportunity was to go to New York. He was actually asked by a small church to give a presentation about himself. And they would pay him $200, worth about $2,000 in today's money, if he would go back to New York, meet with some folks in this church. And Lincoln said yes, not because he thought that this was going to mean very much to him, but because his son was going to school in New York, and it was a great opportunity to visit his son and to brag about being a good politician and see where it might go. But before he got there in February of 1860, he was preceded by a newspaper called the Chester County Times. And on that Times was the first biography of Abraham Lincoln. And it was read aloud by all the new Republicans that were coming together. Don't forget, the Republican Party was very, very much new. The Whig Party was dissipating, and the Republicans were replacing that. And as they read that, they fell in love with Abraham Lincoln. And as a result, the church was no longer large enough to fit the number of folks who wanted to hear Abraham Lincoln, and they had to move it to Cooper Union. Abraham Lincoln wasn't so sure about this. He was really actually a little bit confused. Was he really going to make an effect there? It turns out that it was one of the greatest moves that any single individual could make who was running for president. Abraham Lincoln didn't think he was running for president as he stood at the podium at a room full, standing room only at Cooper Union. But he was loved so much by the audience, and records from the day talk about how they would break into cheers and clapping and sometimes even standing ovations at the remarks of what Abraham Lincoln was doing. And remember, Abraham Lincoln knew how to woo the audience. And he was nervous right at first, but once he warmed up to the audience, they fell in love with each other. After this presentation at Cooper Union, Lincoln was convinced that he could run for president, perhaps even get elected, if he had the support of people like Jesse Bell. And sure enough, Lincoln, right after this, goes down and has still another picture taken of himself. He loved having pictures taken of himself. this was the Lincoln, would be the next president of the United States. Here in Chester County, we honor Lincoln in so many ways. And one of my very favorite is to go to the Freedom Foundation and the Medal of Honor Road. If you haven't been to the Freedom Foundations, not far from, well, it's right in the north part of the county, as you're traveling around throughout national parks and all of that. And you can go into the Freedom Foundation, it's always open, always free. And there are magnificent statues, including this one of Abraham Lincoln. And so that is our legacy to this great president. The rest, as they say, of course, is indeed history. And what I have beyond my words for you here are several little things that I brought on the table. What I would very, very much like you to all take, I'm going to step away from the microphone, I'll be back, is this wonderful, I should have put it in my pocket, but we have the Lincoln Building brochure. And this gives you an abbreviated account of what I just spoke about. They're on the table, and you can take this with you to learn more about the Lincoln Building. During business hours on any particular weekday, you can step inside the Lincoln Building and you can see the notes that came from Abraham Lincoln there, facsimile that are large. You can also see, and I'm going to make mine. Oh, yes, I had to bring this one up with me. So this is brochure they take. And you can also, this morning, have a look at the front page of the Chester County Times. This was a hidden secret for a very long time. Chester County Times published only 1850s, 1860s, and this particular edition, of course, the newspaper disintegrated. And pretty soon, by the 1830s, 1840s, there were only a couple of copies, but one of them was here in Chester County with the Historical Society. And they keep very tender care of it because the paper now is so fragile. It's acid-based paper. And very few people have actually rewritten or published the original biography simply because it was not accessible. And indeed, in some of the books written up until just a few years ago, there was no access and almost no mention of this biography. Now we're seeing people discuss biography and what it meant to Abraham Lincoln and to the rest of the country. It's in these two columns. It looks like it's about 4-point type. I don't know how they could possibly see this myself, but I guess that they did. But now we have it published, and there are a couple of books right over there. There's a gift book, a $75 gift book. That money all goes to support the Lincoln Building. But there's also a paperback book. I happen to be the author, but you don't have to know that. And that has the story that I just told, plus the autobiographical notes and the biography. And so if you want to take home a little bit of history, that's where you might find it. And that paperback book, it's a low price, $20. It's about standard right there. And I'm not insisting that you do that, of course, but if the opportunity moves you, then you can do that. But what I would insist upon is that you take a moment to examine this part of history that Westchester has shared with the rest of the country. So I'd like to thank you all very, very much. And keep in mind, let's see, there we go. For the Union is the calling card for the building downtown, the Lincoln Building downtown. And it is that story that we all relish so much. Thank you. right over here. Do we have a question?
In 1860, Chester County was Democrat. It was represented in Congress by a man named Hickman, I believe. How did it vote in 1860, November 1860?
I believe, that's an excellent question. And I suspect that they voted Republican. Don't forget that the strong party was indeed the Democratic, and they're also the Conservative Party. The more liberal party was the Whig Party, and it was going through its transformation to become Republican. And as I would have to look at an electoral map to answer that question. I would guess that because the Lincoln Building was a Republican headquarters, that Westchester was, I know Pennsylvania voted for Lincoln, I believe. But I would suggest that Pennsylvania was probably behind Lincoln because they were touting it almost on a daily basis.
Yeah, Hickman did convert from Democrat to Republican.
Well, good for him.
He was an interesting person. He was an anti-slavery Democrat, and I think in 1858 he got into a fist fight on the steps of the Capitol with a representative from Virginia, and the Vice President of the United States came over to break up the fight, and the three of them rolled down the steps of the Capitol throwing punches at each other.
Fun days.
So doing it now.
Malcolm, first of all, excellent lecture, fascinating. Kind of a twofold question. First off, was the general public's quick embrace of Lincoln a result of how bad Buchanan was and how he went back on his word? That's the first question. Second is, did the Quakers generally embrace Lincoln quickly as the general public did?
Yeah, as far as Buchanan was concerned, almost from day one, it was very clear that he was not going to be the type of president that they wanted to see here in Chester County, for sure. And every mistake that could be made, he made. He was very unlucky. History has targeted him as being the worst president that we've had. And he was very disappointed in himself that in his presidency, not everything was his fault. I think anybody would have had a tough time in 1856. The clouds of war were, gathering during that presidency. The one thing that Buchanan thought that he should be proud of was that he was able to prevent war during the presidency, but all it did was, raise tensions throughout the country. And of course, the attack upon the Union by the Confederacy, changed everything. Our nation was in civil war for those years.
And then the Quakers, did they readily embrace Lincoln right off the bat?
Yeah, I think they did, to the extent that they're public about those kind of things. My impression from what I've been reading is that they were hesitant about politics. That's kind of, that was not something that they wanted to have in their internal society. And you don't see that many Quakers that run for politics. It wasn't forbidden by any means, but there are some religious sects that just see themselves separate from the rest of the population. Thank you.
Lincoln visited Chester County one last time. You want to mention that?
He did indeed. He actually he came through twice. The first time was on a train going to the White House and where he would take his position as president. And when the train stopped in downtown, I gave a speech off the back of the train. The second time was its funeral train, coming back from Washington DC, and the train stopped several times, including a few times here in Chester County. And indeed, there are some households here in Chester County that have little splinters of wood that come off that train, and what some say the coffin, though I had a tough time imagining that. But that was the final time that Lincoln came through, was on his death train.
Where is the Freedom Foundation located in Chester County?
Valley Forge, if you know Valley Forge and you're leaving to go into the, main part of Chester County from the Washington House on that road, I'm trying to think what road it is, I can't. 23, I'm pretty sure that's it. When you live here long enough, you don't pay attention, that's why anyway, as you're leaving Valley Forge, it's on the right hand side, you'll see a sign, not a giant flashing sign, but it says Freedom Foundation. You simply pull into the parking lot, it becomes very, very quiet, it's an excellent park. And very, very quiet, you can see the grove of the Medal of Honors, everyone who won a Medal of Honor, including one is recognized at the grove. And then there are other places that have recognition. George Washington statue is a fabulous one. The Abraham Lincoln statue is like right in front of the grove before you enter it. But it's such a serene place that just going and spending a half an hour refreshes the soul. It's so quiet and so nice. And the visitors who come are always respectful to each other.
If I may ask, I was wondering about the Quakers, on a more personal level, did they become involved at all in buying slaves so that they could provide humane treatment and set them free? I mean, maybe they would work for them, that they would be treated better. Was there any of that, or save a black family, perhaps something like that?
That is a very interesting question.
Thank you.
William Everhart is my hero in that sense. Back in the 1850s, there was indeed a young man who had crossed the line. He was in the Underground Railroad going north, but he was captured in Westchester by U.S. Marshals, and he was put in front of a judge, which is what they did. His crime was being a black slave running for freedom. And so he's put in front of the justice, and the justice says, for $200, you can buy your freedom. He didn't have $200, And that got back to William Everhart. William Everhart was the wealthiest man in town, and he was wealthier than everybody else put together. And he went up to the young man, and he looked around at his friends, and he said, I'm going to make a contribution of $10 to buy this man's freedom, and he expected all of his friends, he asked all of his friends, I want you to chip in $5, $10, we'll collect that money so we get $200 and we will buy his freedom. At first, when I read that, I knew he'd just do it himself, but he wanted the community to do it. That's the brilliance of people like that. That it's not just about themselves. I can say it wasn't just about themselves being wealthy. It was about them being good neighbors with a community of good neighbors. And so that one story, I think, tells a lot. When I look at photographs from the day, I see a lot of integration. So I think that there are strong suggestions that say that the culture of the day was one of equal freedom before and after the Civil War.
Thank you.
Well, thank you very much.
That was very enlightening. On June 22nd, we'll have our next history presentation. It's going to be a brief history of West Town Township, the township we all live in. Up until 1950, there was only about 900 people living in West Town. And there's a lot of history associated with the first couple hundred years, and then 1950, the township exploded into the close to 12,000 we have today. So I hope we'll see you all on Saturday, June 22nd, for the next lecture in our West Town Township Historical Commission series. Thank you all for coming.